I hid his twin girls for 5 years, until one of them asked the Korean Mafia boss, "Why are you staring at my mom?" The story begins in the damp, unforgiving streets of London, where a resilient black woman has spent 5 years raising twin daughters in total anonymity. To the world, she is a hard-working professional. To her daughters, she is their entire universe. But she is also a resilient protector harboring a secret that could incinerate their quiet life. Her children are the only heirs to the Han Syndicate, a global criminal monolith. 5 years ago, during a period of civil unrest, she was saved by a man who was less a human and more a king of shadows, a tall, broad-shouldered Korean man with a lethal gaze and absolute power. Their brief, intense connection left her pregnant and him unaware of his legacy. She fled to London to ensure her daughters, the dragon's inheritance, would never have to carry the burden of their father's fire. The silence was shattered when a positive paternity test found its way onto a polished mahogany table in the heart of Seoul. The father, a man who ruled with solitary power and a cold heart, stared at the results, not with anger, but with an awe and terror he had never before felt. The realization that he had a family didn't just change him, it compromised him. To the Syndicate's Council of Elders, this vulnerability was a liability that needed to be sharpened or removed. The Syndicate's enforcers, the statue of obsidian guard, tracked the family to London. What followed was a surgical operation to bring the girls and their mother back to the lion's den in Seoul. For the mother, the move was a sacrificial pride. She would walk into the heart of the empire to ensure her daughters were recognized and protected, even if it meant becoming a ghost herself. Upon arrival in Seoul, the twins, 6-year-old Serena and Sienna, showed they were indeed their father's children. Serena, the statue of boldness, stood her ground against the Syndicate's most hardened killers, her fearless spirit acting as her crown. Sienna, the mirror of observation, silently catalogued every pattern, every guard, and every hidden exit, becoming the architect of their safety within the monolith of glass and cold steel. The father found himself caught between two worlds. By day, he wore obsidian suits and managed the Syndicate's absolute power. By night, he sat in the shadows of his daughters' rooms, listening to bedtime stories and realizing that he was no longer a king who ruled alone. The positive truth of a father's love began to dissolve the hardness around his eyes, but the Council of Elders was already moving against him. Tensions reached a breaking point at the Grand Hyatt Gala, an altar of the dragon where the family was used as bait to expose the Syndicate's rivals. An assassination attempt was thwarted not by the Syndicate's might, but by the father's desperate need to protect his own. A single, silent dart found its mark, and the transition was seamless, but the invisible wall of their anonymity was gone forever. The council, realizing the father had lost the stomach for the throne, demanded the ultimate Syndicate's price. The girls were to be sent to a military boarding school, and the mother was to be compensated and exiled back to London. The King of Shadows was presented with a choice, his empire or his soul. He didn't negotiate. In a final, tectonic shift of power, he placed his gold signet ring on the table and walked away from the altar. He traded the dragon's blood for a life in the light, realizing that the only empire that mattered was the one built on love. As the family steps out of the Syndicate's headquarters and into the cool Seoul night, they are no longer fugitives or mafia royalty. They are just 4 people standing on a sidewalk, looking toward a future where the shadows can no longer touch them. But as they prepare to leave for a sanctuary in the hills of Tuscany, a final piece of the Syndicate's reach is about to be revealed. The move from the corporate boardroom to Jaehyun's private estate was a transition from one type of battlefield to another, though the weapons here were wrapped in silk and silence. The sprawling complex, perched on the edge of a cliff overlooking the Han River, was a fortress of glass and charcoal stone, designed to be impenetrable to both bullets and prying eyes. For the girls, it was a palace of endless corridors and hidden gardens. For Alina, it was the physical manifestation of the lion's den she had tried to avoid. She watched from the floor-to-ceiling windows as a small army of black-suited men patrolled the perimeter, their earpieces glowing like fireflies in the twilight. The Syndicate's price was no longer a threat whispered in a meeting, it was the atmosphere they breathed. Within the first 48 hours, the dragon's inheritance began to reshape the cold, clinical halls of the estate. Serena's statue of boldness was unyielding. She treated the high-level security detail like her personal playmates, demanding they show her how the surveillance monitors worked or challenging the stoic guards to races down the marble gallery. She didn't fear the men who terrified the rest of Seoul. She looked at them and saw a kingdom that was rightfully hers to explore. She would stand in the center of the grand foyer, her yellow lace dress replaced by a soft cashmere sweater provided by the house staff, and command the attention of the room with a mere tilt of her chin. Sienna, however, remained the mirror of observation. While Serena conquered the space, Sienna mapped it. She memorized the shift changes of the guards, the silent click of the electronic locks, and the way the shadow of the cliff fell across the terrace at noon. She sat in the massive library, her feet dangling from a velvet armchair, watching Jae-hyun through the glass doors of his study. She didn't seek his affection, she sought to understand the mechanics of his power. She saw the way his jaw tightened when he spoke on the phone and the way his eyes never truly rested, even when he was looking at them. Jae-hyun himself was a man undergoing a violent internal reconstruction. The statue of obsidian was cracking under the weight of a domesticity he was never trained for. He found himself lingering in the hallways, watching his daughters from the shadows, paralyzed by a mixture of awe and terror. He didn't know how to approach them without the armor of his status. When he finally attempted to sit with them during dinner, the silence was a living thing. He watched Serena eat with a messy, fearless enthusiasm and Sienna navigate her plate with a surgical, cautious precision. "Is this what you wanted for them?" Jae-hyun asked Alina one evening, his voice a low rasp that broke the quiet of the terrace. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at the girls playing with a golden retriever in the garden below, a dog he had ordered purely because he had seen Serena mention one in a picture book. Alina stood beside him, her sacrificial pride now tempered by the reality of their situation. "I wanted them to be free," she replied, her eyes fixed on the girls. "I wanted them to never know the meaning of the word syndicate. But looking at them now, standing in your house, I realize they were never going to be ordinary. They carry too much of you." The admission was a jagged peace treaty. Jae-hyun finally turned to her, the positive truth of their shared history reflected in the softening of his gaze. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching, a rare moment of vulnerability from a man who had built an empire on iron. He realized that the altar of the dragon wasn't just about protecting the heirs, it was about learning to be a man worthy of the family he had accidentally created. The monster was still there, lurking beneath the charcoal suit, but for the first time in his life, the King of Shadows was looking for a way into the light. The sanctuary of the cliffside estate was a masterpiece of invisible walls and high-tech isolation, but the peace it offered was as fragile as a breath on a cold window. While Alina tried to anchor the twins in a semblance of normalcy, the lion's den was already shifting its geography. The syndicate's internal hierarchy, a complex web of statue of obsidian loyalty and hidden agendas, was beginning to vibrate with the news of the dragon's inheritance. For the Council of Elders and rival factions, Serena and Sienna weren't just children, they were a consolidation of Jae-hyun's power that threatened to make him untouchable. The syndicate's price manifested on a rain-slicked Thursday. Jae-hyun was in his study, the billion-dollar deal merger documents pushed aside for a set of tactical reports that no longer concerned logistics, but life. A breach had been detected in the digital perimeter, not a hack, but a leak. Someone within his own inner circle had sold the coordinates of the girls' schoolrooms and the frequency of their security earpieces to the rival Choi clan. "They aren't just targeting me anymore," Jae-hyun whispered, the King of Shadows resurfacing with a terrifying, cold focus. "They are targeting the future." Alina entered the study, her sacrificial pride immediately sensing the shift in the room's temperature. She didn't need to see the red blinking lights on the monitors to know the altar of the dragon was under threat. She saw the way Jae-hyun's hand gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The man who had once been her greatest fear was now her only ally in a war that had no rules. We can't just hide, Alina said, her voice steady despite the hammer of her heart. Sienna saw a black car following the school transport yesterday. She didn't say anything until this morning. She's already playing the mirror of observation, Jae-hyun. She's waiting for us to act. Jae-hyun looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a captive or a translator. He saw a partner. If we wait for them to strike, we've already lost. The Choi clan expects me to go into a defensive crouch. They expect me to bury you all in a bunker. He stood up, the statue of obsidian reaching its full, lethal height. We're going to give them a target they can't resist, and then we're going to burn the ground beneath them. The plan was a high-stakes boardroom collision of a different sort. Alina would act as the bait, taking the girls to a highly publicized charity gala. A move that seemed like an act of sacrificial pride or sheer arrogance. Meanwhile, Jae-hyun would lead a surgical counterstrike against the Choi's main distribution hub. It was a gamble that required Alina to trust the monster completely, and for the monster to trust the woman to keep his heart beating in the middle of a snake pit. Serena, sensing the tension, walked into the room, her statue of boldness on full display. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stood between her parents, her small hand finding Jae-hyun's. Are we going to fight the bad men now? She asked, her dark eyes reflecting the same ruthless resolve that had made her father the king of shadows. Jae-hyun knelt, a rare and profound softening occurring as he looked at the mirror image of his own soul. Yes, he said, his voice a low, sacred vow. We are going to make sure they never look at us again. The Grand Hyatt's Crystal Ballroom was a masterpiece of opulence and high-stakes theater, a shimmering altar of the dragon where the elite of Seoul gathered to see and be seen. Alina stood at the top of the marble staircase, her sacrificial pride cloaked in a gown of midnight silk that whispered against the floor. Beside her, Serena and Sienna were twin beacons of vibrant yellow, their presence a calculated defiance against the syndicate's price hanging over their heads. To the world, they were the debut of a hidden royal family. To the king of shadows watching through a concealed earpiece, they were the ultimate bait. As they descended into the crowd, Alina felt the invisible wall of her anonymity vanish forever. Every camera flash felt like a gunshot, every polite smile from a rival executive like a bared fang. She moved through the room with a practiced grace, her mind a frantic mirror of observation. She wasn't looking at the jewelry or the champagne. She was scanning the perimeter, identifying the men who stood too still and the waitstaff whose eyes never left the girls. Mom, that man by the pillar has a cold heart, Sienna whispered, her voice a low vibration of instinctive guardedness. The 5-year-old was already outperforming the statue of obsidian security detail. She had noticed a server with a scar behind his ear, a man whose movements were too fluid, too precise for someone carrying a tray of appetizers. Alina's hand tightened on Sienna's. She didn't look directly at the man. Instead, she adjusted her earring, tapping the transmitter hidden in the jewel. Target identified. Southeast pillar. Blue vest, she murmured, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The response from Jae-hyun was a low, guttural ghost of a sound. I see him. Don't move. Serena, stay close to your mother. Serena, true to her statue of boldness, didn't shrink back. She stood taller, her dark eyes scanning the room as if she were the one hunting the predators. She reached out and grabbed a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray, her small jaw set in a line of obsidian hard resolve. She wasn't a victim, she was the dragon's inheritance, and she refused to be afraid in her father's city. The boardroom collision happened in a heartbeat. The server moved, reaching into his vest, but the king of shadows was faster. From the shadows of the mezzanine, a single, silent dart found its mark, and the assassin collapsed into the arms of 2 undercover enforcers before a single guest could scream. The transition was seamless, a surgical operation performed in the middle of a gala. Alina let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 years. She looked up at the mezzanine, catching a fleeting glimpse of a dark silhouette against the glass. Jae-hyun was there, a silent sentinel guarding the family he was only just beginning to understand. The trap had been sprung, and the Choi clan had learned a lethal lesson. The lion's den was no longer a place of solitary power, but a fortress built on the positive truth of a father's love. The night was far from over, but as Alina led the girls toward the safety of the waiting sedan, she realized the mirror images were no longer just reflections of a monster. They were the architects of a new legacy, one that would eventually burn the syndicate to the ground to build something better. The aftermath of the Grand Hyatt Gala left a scent of ozone and desperation in its wake. The failed assassination hadn't just exposed the Choi clan's cowardice, it had forced the Han Syndicate's Council of Elders to realize that Jae-hyun was no longer a solitary weapon they could sharpen. He was a father, and that vulnerability made him a liability to the old guard. By the time the black sedan crossed the threshold of the Syndicate's headquarters, a monolith of glass and cold steel, the atmosphere had shifted from protective to executionary. The lion's den was now a house divided. Alina felt the change the moment the elevator doors opened to the executive level. The usual row of submissive secretaries was gone, replaced by Mingyu and a dozen of the syndicate's most senior enforcers. They stood in 2 rows, a human gauntlet of statue of obsidian loyalty that felt more like a cage than a welcome. Serena squeezed Alina's hand, her statue of boldness flaring as she stared down the men with a dark, intense observation that made even the most hardened killers shift their feet. Sienna remained a shadow at Alina's side, her eyes darting to the tactical placements of the guards. She knew this was a trap. "The council is waiting," Jae-hyun, Mingyu said, his voice stripped of its usual reverence. "They believe that Dragon's inheritance is a distraction. They want the bloodline secured, but the mother and the king, they believe you've lost the stomach for the throne." Jae-hyun didn't stop. He walked through the gauntlet, his hand resting on Serena's shoulder, a physical declaration that he was no longer a king who ruled alone. When he reached the heavy double doors of the inner sanctum, he turned to Alina. The positive truth in his eyes was replaced by a final, desperate clarity. He wasn't looking at a consultant or a secret he'd hidden for 5 years. He was looking at his conscience. "If I go in there as their king, you and the girls will always be pieces on their board," Jae-hyun whispered, his voice a low vibration that only Alina could hear. "But if I go in there as a father, I lose the empire." Alina looked at her daughters. Serena, the fearless commander in a yellow dress, and Sienna, the silent strategist. She realized that the altar of the dragon was no place for children, but it was the only place where they could be truly set free. "Then don't be their king," she said, her sacrificial pride finally finding its ultimate purpose. "Be the man who saved me in the riot. Be the man they are afraid of because you have something worth more than their gold." Jae-hyun kicked the doors open. The final showdown was not a battle of bullets, but of wills. The council sat in the darkness, their faces obscured, demanding the syndicate's price. The girls were to be sent to a military boarding school, and Alina was to be compensated and sent back to London. "No," Jae-hyun said, the word echoing like a thunderclap in the vast room. He didn't offer a compromise. He didn't negotiate. He reached into his jacket and placed his signet ring, the symbol of the Han Syndicate's absolute power, on the table. "I am walking out of this room with my family. You can have the empire, the blood, and the shadows. But you will never touch them." The silence that followed was a tectonic shift. For the first time in history, a dragon had walked away from the altar. Mingyu looked from the ring to Jae-hyun, the statue of obsidian loyalty finally cracking. He stepped aside, followed slowly by the other enforcers. They weren't choosing a new king. They were choosing to let the monster go. As they stepped out of the building and into the cool Seoul night, the invisible wall was gone for good. They were no longer a mafia boss and his secret family. They were just 4 people standing on a sidewalk, the city lights reflecting in the girls' dark, curious eyes. Jae-hyun looked at Alina, the king of shadows finally stepping into the light. "Where to now?" he asked. Alina smiled, the fear of the last 5 years finally dissolving. "Home. Somewhere with a garden. And no black cars." The Mediterranean sun was a far cry from the oppressive neon of Seoul or the damp grey of London. A year had passed since the night at the altar of the dragon, a year of trading obsidian suits for linen shirts and tactical reports for bedtime stories. In a quiet villa tucked away in the hills of Tuscany, the Han Syndicate was nothing more than a ghost story, a dark fairy tale from a past life. Here, the air smelled of rosemary and lemon groves, and the only statue of obsidian in sight was a weathered garden sculpture that Serena had claimed as her royal throne. The dragon's inheritance, however, was not something that could be outrun by geography. It lived on in the way the girls moved through the world. The cobblestone streets with a commanding, unearned authority. She didn't need a signet ring to rule, her fearless spirit was her crown. When a stray dog wandered into their garden, she didn't retreat. She stood her ground, her tiny jaw set, and offered her hand with the same steady resolve Jae-hyun had once used to stare down his council of elders. She was a girl who knew she was protected, and that security had turned her innate power into a force for fierce, unshakable kindness. Sienna, the mirror of observation, had found her own peace in the villa's vast library. She was the one who noticed the subtle change in the wind before a storm, or the exact moment the olives were ready for harvest. She spent her afternoons sketching the landscape with a precision that was terrifyingly focused. She still watched the perimeter, her eyes occasionally scanning the winding road up the hill, but the suspicion had softened into a vigilant serenity. She knew every inch of their sanctuary, every creak in the floorboards, and every secret path through the orchard. She was the architect of their safety, a silent strategist who ensured the shadows never touched them again. Alina sat on the terrace, watching the girls race through the silver-green leaves of the olive trees. Her sacrificial pride had finally found its rest. She was no longer a ghost or a fugitive, she was the foundation of a new legacy. Beside her, Jae-hyun. Now just Jae-hyun, a man who had traded his empire for a soul, sat with a book he wasn't reading. His eyes were fixed on his daughters, his face stripped of the King of Shadows mask. The hardness around his eyes had dissolved, replaced by the positive truth of a life he never thought he deserved. "They look like they've lived here forever," Jae-hyun murmured, his hand finding Alina's on the table. The touch was no longer hesitant, it was the anchor of their shared reality. "They were born for the light," Alina replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We just had to find the right place to let them grow." The syndicate's price had been high, and the scars of the lion's den would never fully vanish, but the payoff was a silence that wasn't heavy or terrifying. It was the silence of a home. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the hills, the family stood together. A former monster, a resilient protector, and two girls who carried the strength of a dragon without the burden of its fire. They were free, and in the quiet of the Italian twilight, the only empire that mattered was the one they had built out of love.